Okay, so I wanted to cover what programs look like when you actually look at the data, right? So I thought a good place to start would be some type of linear block periodization model. And who does that better than Renaissance periodization? Periodization's in the name, and that's what they essentially follow. Um, this right here is actually on their web store where you could select a lot of different parameters. Pounds, kilos, and the amount of days you train per week actually, as far as I understand, don't have that large an effect on the amount of volume that you get. However, how long you've been training in powerlifting, and especially gender, really do affect how many sets they start you off per week. Really, I've seen some other templates from different body weights, different genders, and that is the main thing that's different between them. It is just how many sets they start you off per week. And the template we're going to be looking at is actually going to be on the very, very lighter end, so very few sets per week. And weight class will affect it as well. Heavier people, less sets, lighter people, more sets. So that's how it works, and that's what it looks like. Okay, so weekly metrics. Some things to start out with. For this particular lifter, we have assumed that they have followed it to a T and they have completed all the work as prescribed. So we are assuming that the program is practical enough that you could follow it straight through exactly to a T. However, we have also said that they have made zero progress, because if we say, oh, well, we might expect progress around week 6, well, we don't know that. It's easier to just keep everything the same. Further, Renaissance Periodization has like an auto-regulation type volume system where they will increase the number of sets if you say you easily completed all the work. You could also maintain, or you could reduce the number of sets if you felt like that was too much work. For this, I have elected to say maintain across the board so the program follows its natural progression. There are 3 distinct blocks. There is hypertrophy, there is strength, and then there is a peaking phase. There is a deload after every week. It's 4, 4, and 3 weeks. However, I have elected to remove the deloads simply because there's nothing special there. It's like a cut of 15 to 20% of 1RM, and you're doing half the reps that you did at your starting intensity. Now, the way that this is prescribed is they will ask you for N rep max and give you a training max. Hypertrophy, I believe it's like a 10 rep max or 8 rep max, and then like accessory lifts will normally tend to have higher rep maxes that they request from you. The reps numbers are not prescribed, so they never really intend to say, oh, I want you to hit 60% for 8 reps. They will just give you a weight. You don't know how to get that weight. Really, they're just multiplying a certain percentage of the 10 rep max, 8 rep max, or whatever, and then they say, do that until you're 3 reps away from failure. How you're supposed to determine that 3 reps away from failure is kind of like not very well explained, and you just kind of have to figure it out. It is kind of a poor man's way of going about RPE, and I disagree with it, but it is the way that they have chosen to do it. And further, one of the issues is you don't know if these rep max translations are appropriate. Some people have these issues where because the rep count is not prescribed, they don't know if they're hitting too few or too many reps. And a lot of people actually tend to play with their rep maxes, so they're not actually plugging in their actual 10 RM. They are saying, oh, well, it's a hypertrophy phase, but I only got 6, so I'm going to bump that down. And that just messes with everything. Because you don't know how much you're supposed to hit, you don't know if you're following the program. And I think that's one of the main criteria that I stated in one of my other videos is, in order for a program to be good, you have to have adherence. To have adherence, you have to understand how it works. And there are many things in this that are a little bit hard to understand because it's not normal. It's not that it's super confusing, it's just something that you're not used to. Now, the way that these exercises are chosen, because it is powerlifting focus, it is a lot of focus on the squat, bench, and deadlift. In your hypertrophy and your strength cycles, your strength blocks, you will normally have your main squat, a variation of that squat, a main bench, a variation of that bench, main deadlift, and a variation of that deadlift. You'll also have two pulling movements for the most part, two shoulder movements. A lot of it tends to focus on medial delt instead of anterior delt, which is what I would argue is better for the bench press, and as well as one hamstring movement. And I do really like having that one hamstring movement because that tends to be what people neglect the most, and I think it has a lot of transference over into your deadlift. What is missing, though, is you are missing a lot of direct chest isolation type accessory work. You are missing a lot of quad isolation hypertrophy work. That's just something that, as a general thing, is not included by default. Now, granted, you do have the choice to elect other shoulder movement of your choice or other hip dominant movement of your choice. And yeah, you could add accessories, but we're not trying to build out RP in its best modification that I would choose, really just the starting point, what they suggest. So, with that said, that is how it works. Let's get into how it ticks. So one thing that you will notice is that then the number of lifts seems like it kind of cuts down as time goes on. And that's really just a function of intensity increasing and relative intensity. Intensity would just be how heavy it is. Relative intensity would be how close it is to grindy. Whether or not you're going 3 reps away from failure or 1 rep away from failure. And that's how they tend to prescribe it. They will start you off at 3 or 2, and they will work you up to 1 rep away from failure. And you could see that the sets increase over time for the hypertrophy cycle. However, it does that with increasing intensity, and you're normally seeing a gradual downturn in the number of lifts. In terms of what that actually looks like in terms of tonnage is fairly flat for hypertrophy. Yeah, it goes down from week 1 to week 2, but it kind of works its way back up. And on the whole, if you average it out, it's pretty flat. Everything's very, very close to the average. And for hypertrophy, it's actually very, very vanilla. Not a lot of mixed intensity distribution, and you'll see the bulk of it is somewhere between 70 to 80% of 1RM. Everything's been translated to 1RM because that's a language I feel like everyone understands. Okay, so moving on to the strength block. The strength block is where it starts getting a lot more varied and different. You could see that it looks like there's some undulation in this averaged intensity and this average relative intensity. So it seems like it's actually lower intensity on the whole. However, that's average. When you look at the distribution, you definitely see from week 5 to week 8 that there is a change in intensity. It's a lot more varied, a lot more sub 70% efforts, especially in the deadlift. And that tends to drag the intensity down. So it's good to look at this from intensity distribution. What percent of the number of lifts are hard efforts and what percent of them are easy efforts? Once you get into strength, you start seeing a lot more introduction of easier efforts, lighter intensity, sub 70%. And you could see that sets are pretty flat until week 8. In week 8, it just pumps them all up across the board. It's going from about 9 sets to 10 sets, or 8 sets to 10 sets, so it's not a huge difference. And if you look at overall tonnage for the intensity, you see it drops with strength. Now, there is a very rapid decrease in tonnage and a very rapid decrease in the number of lifts. And I would say that when I ran this, I did have a little bit of intensity shock. I felt like going from hypertrophy to strength felt really huge. mostly because there was that huge difference in intensity. You could see here that it really switches over really quickly. Like hypertrophy phase, the intensity, it does increase, but it's very, very gradual. It's like blocks of 2 weeks if you were to divide it up, where it's the same. Whereas with strength, it feels like you get 1 week and then you immediately transition into your next intensity. You stay there for 1 week and then you transition into the next intensity block. So it is a lot faster progression in once you move over to your strength block. And I would argue that it is not the best. It's a little bit hard to get over. That's personal experience, but this is what the data looks like. And it does look like it is a huge drop-off in every way that you look at it, in terms of sets, in terms of tonnage, in terms of number of lifts. It seems huge. So going into the peaking phase, which is week 9 to week 11, you could see that the number of lifts actually increases. And intensity, average relative intensity really drops off. And that seems like, well, that doesn't look normal, that doesn't look right. And you could see that sets are generally pretty stagnant. They're staying where they were as compared to the first 3 weeks of your strength phase. And tonnage is actually increased, which is the opposite of what you would expect for a peaking block. You would expect peaking, you're trying to dissipate some of that excess fatigue, and you don't really have a need for volume, so it shouldn't increase. If you look at on the whole, though, if you were to average that out, that is pretty much the same thing as your strength block. It is about, on average, for those 3 weeks, the same. Now, in terms of intensity and relative intensity and why it's so odd that it does it this way, just look at the intensity distribution. It's bipolar. You have a lot of different mixtures of higher intensities down into a lot of these triples is what they normally do. They say either do singles or do triples, and it's anywhere from 70% to, I believe, 80% triples, which are pretty easy efforts. So they'll have some sets like those, and they'll have other ones where it's like, okay, I want you to do 90%, and I want you to do it until you're at 2 fail. So it's one or the other. It's easy or it's hard. There's no in between. And normally the way they order it is your first movement is your heaviest movement, and then your second, third tends to be your lighter movements. That's up until your final days, where you have like 2 hard movements. I believe it's a squat and a bench, right? But that's how they're ordering it, and it looks weird when you graph it out as averages, but when you look at the intensity distribution, it kind of makes sense. And you could take those singles or triples as basically technique work, is what they really are, because the relative intensity is really low. The relative intensity is really low, and the intensity overall is really low. But they're low enough that you could practice the lifts and practice executing them well. And some people might argue, well, if it's too easy, it's junk volume. Like, well, not if you're peaking and you need to practice the skill. I don't think junk volume, as most people define it, is that clear of a thing. So I think this does generally show you, even for something as simple as a linear block periodization, that's a lot more complicated than just looking at, does it look right? Because this, to be honest, doesn't look that right. But then when I take that into account with the intensity distributions, like, oh yeah, that looks right. That looks right. If I didn't know this graph right here existed, and I only had that to look at, I would say, yep, that looks like a good program worth following. Now, I mean, I really did say it's all about the safety is first of all, and I think the way it's ordered is reasonable to have a safe expectation. You don't have a lot of accessories before main movements, and you don't have a lot of like crazy circumstances that would really have you so fatigued that you would compromise form. So safety is not a concern. Adherence is kind of a concern because even though they do include frequently asked questions in the guide, there are some things that are just not normal, so you do have a lot of questions. They do have this RIR system that is very much unlike how anyone does it, and I believe that's mostly because that's how Mike Israetel prefers to prescribe bodybuilding. And I think that's something that just carries over in the powerlifting. I don't think it translates essentially well. So, if anything, I would say adherence is what makes it the hardest sell. Now, in terms of outcomes, I would say that on the whole, it looks like it's supposed to do what it does. However, they do have a lot of these cookie cutter canned responses of like who needs how much volume. I think they do it really well when it comes to women. However, they don't necessarily do it really well when it comes to individuals. I wasn't making progress on this, and I believe it was just because I needed more volume. And if you say that you are intermediate male of this body weight, they really just don't give you that much sets to work with. I did try to run the template again, and once I figured out that all those parameters really just change how many sets you start with, I could probably get more out of it if I just added 2 sets to everything to begin with. That cycle went a little bit better, but I would not say that it was the best way for me to run a program. I just needed to move on and run a program of my own that challenged me with a lot more volume. That way I can make the progress that I needed to. But anyways, that's what it looks like. And remember, this is the easy version.